Medieval doctors just bled people until they died. That's the myth most of us believed. A grim image of masked plague doctors, jars of leeches, and herbs thrown together like magic potions. But what if I told you that's not the whole story? What if medieval medicine, as horrifying as it sounds, wasn't completely backwards, and in some cases, was even ahead of its time? In this video, we're diving deep into the brutal, bizarre, and surprisingly brilliant world of medieval healthcare. We'll bust through the myths, trace the forgotten origins of medical theory, and uncover the truth behind the bleeding, the potions, and the prayers. Because the reality of medieval medicine isn't just about what they got wrong, it's more about the foundations they laid for everything we know today. When most people imagine medieval medicine, they picture chaos, frantic priests waving incense, surgeons sawing limbs with no anesthesia, and every illness being treated with unimaginable procedures. But the truth is, these practices came from a much older medical philosophy, one that had been passed down for over 1,000 years. Popular culture has done a great job of making medieval doctors look like clueless torturers. Films and TV often depict them as either charlatans or lunatics. We see plague doctors in long black robes and beaked masks, storming through streets filled with the dead. But that's only one side of the story, and even that's a bit skewed. For instance, those famous beaked masks. They weren't used until the 17th century, well after the height of the medieval era. And while leeches were used, they weren't the cure-all we assume they were. So why does this image persist? Because it's easy to mock what we don't understand. The Middle Ages were dark, yes, but they weren't empty of knowledge. People were trying, desperately, to make sense of the human body, to heal the sick, and to preserve life. The tragedy is that they were doing it without the benefit of microscopes, germ theory, or antibiotics. But what they lacked in science, they tried to replace with structure, tradition, and belief. And as we'll see next, a lot of that structure came from one man whose ideas ruled medicine for over a millennium. If there's one name you need to know when it comes to medieval medicine, it's Galen, a Roman physician who lived in the 2nd century. Galen's medical theories shaped European and Middle Eastern healthcare for over 1,300 years. His central idea? That the body was governed by 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that good health depended on keeping them in balance. This theory wasn't based on experiments or germs. It was based on logic, observation, and the philosophies of earlier thinkers like Hippocrates. Galen's writings were incredibly detailed. He performed animal dissections to understand anatomy, and wrote volumes of medical texts that became the gold standard for centuries. After the fall of Rome, when much of Europe's knowledge infrastructure collapsed, these texts survived thanks to one unlikely place: the Christian monasteries. Monasteries became the keepers of knowledge. Monks painstakingly copied Galen's texts by hand, preserving his work in libraries while the rest of the continent struggled through chaos and war. These same monks often acted as healers for their communities. While their treatments may have relied on outdated theories, they were doing their best to offer structured care in a world that desperately needed it. Still, even with Galen's theories intact, Europe was largely isolated. The real medical advancements during the early Middle Ages weren't happening in castles or cathedrals. They were unfolding in an entirely different part of the world, and that's where the real progress was quietly being made. While medieval Europe was clinging to Galen's texts, another world was rising in scientific brilliance: the Islamic Golden Age. From the 8th to the 13th century, scholars in the Islamic world preserved, translated, and expanded upon the medical knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and then pushed it even further. In Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, physicians like al-Razi, Razis, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna, weren't just repeating Galen. They were challenging him, correcting him, and introducing groundbreaking ideas. Al-Razi wrote extensively on smallpox and measles, offering some of the first clear descriptions of infectious diseases. Ibn Sina's masterwork, The Canon of Medicine, became the most influential medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Christian Europe for centuries. These scholars built hospitals that were far more advanced than anything in Europe at the time. They emphasized cleanliness, patient records, and ethical care. They developed early forms of quarantine, advanced pharmacology, and diagnostic techniques that felt shockingly modern. Islamic medicine wasn't just a stepping stone, it was a driving force behind Europe's medical evolution. So how did their work reach Europe? Through a process of translation and transmission. As European scholars rediscovered Arabic medical texts, often through contact in Spain, Sicily, and during the Crusades, they began translating them into Latin. This sparked a slow transformation in European medicine, blending ancient Greek ideas with Islamic innovation. Without this bridge, Europe might have remained stuck in Galen's shadow much longer. The Islamic Golden Age didn't just preserve knowledge, it advanced it, refined it, and ultimately handed it back to a Europe finally ready to listen. Next, we'll examine what those European doctors actually did with that knowledge, from leeches to herbal potions and everything in between. So what did medieval doctors actually use to treat people? The image of a physician with a jar of leeches isn't entirely wrong, but it's also just the tip of the iceberg. First, let's talk about bloodletting. It wasn't done randomly. Physicians followed detailed diagrams called bleeding charts, which indicated which veins should be opened for specific ailments. They believed each organ was connected to a different part of the body through humoral balance, so bleeding the right spot was considered vital. The goal? Restore harmony among the four humors. Leeches were used, especially for delicate areas where a blade was too risky, but they weren't the go-to tool for everything. More commonly, physicians prescribed herbal remedies, and some of them actually worked. Lavender was used for anxiety, garlic for infection, and willow bark, which contains salicin, a compound similar to aspirin, for pain relief. These remedies were part of a growing body of herbal knowledge shared across monasteries, apothecaries, and traveling healers. Then came the barber surgeons. These were the hands-on practitioners who performed basic surgical procedures, setting broken bones, lancing boils, and extracting teeth. They also handled more gruesome tasks like amputations, often without anesthesia, of course. The iconic barber pole, the red and white stripes symbolize blood and bandages, a relic of their dual roles. One of the most remarkable figures from this era was Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess and polymath. She wrote extensively on natural medicine, combining spiritual insight with empirical observation. Her work on plants, diets, and holistic healing was centuries ahead of its time and remains a subject of study today. So while the medieval toolkit may seem primitive now, it wasn't entirely misguided. It reflected a serious attempt to understand and care for the human body, with the tools, beliefs, and limitations of the time, and it paved the way for future advancements in both surgical techniques and herbal medicine. Medieval hospitals weren't hospitals as we think of them today, but they were the beginning of something significant. Rooted in religious charity, these early institutions were often attached to monasteries and run by monks and nuns. Their goal wasn't just to heal the body, but also to care for the soul. Many of these hospitals functioned more like hospices or shelters. They offered beds, food, and comfort to the sick, the poor, and those in need of care. Medical treatment was secondary to spiritual care, but the presence of such institutions showed a growing recognition of the need for organized health services. The care was simple: rest, warmth, clean bedding, herbal infusions, but for many, that alone made the difference between life and death. As time passed, some hospitals began to adopt more medical roles. Influenced by Arabic medical texts and scholars returning from the Crusades or studies abroad, they started incorporating basic diagnostics and patient observation. Hygiene was encouraged, especially in monastic settings, where ritual cleanliness was already an integral part of daily life. Though they lacked our understanding of contagion, these practices helped reduce the spread of infection in close quarters. One often overlooked innovation was the keeping of patient records. Even in rudimentary form, these notes marked the start of evidence-based observation, a fundamental principle in modern medicine. Hospitals also developed special wards for different types of patients: the mentally ill, lepers, and travelers. While rudimentary and sometimes segregated unjustly, this approach signaled an evolving awareness of public health needs. In larger cities, hospitals like Hôtel Dieu in Paris or St. Bartholomew's in London served hundreds at a time. These were not places of guaranteed recovery, but they offered the poor and marginalized something rare in the medieval world: dignity, rest, and care in the face of suffering. So while bleeding and herbal tinctures were still common, medieval healthcare wasn't confined to dusty apothecaries and village folk remedies. A quiet but powerful shift was happening in how people viewed illness, care, and community responsibility. But even with these strides, medieval medicine still had massive blind spots, especially when it came to understanding disease itself. Despite all the effort to balance humors and treat wounds, medieval medicine was riddled with catastrophic misunderstandings. The most glaring? The total absence of germ theory. Diseases weren't blamed on bacteria or viruses. They were chalked up to bad air, divine punishment, or astrological misalignment. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, it killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people. Physicians had no idea what caused it. Some burned incense to purify the air. Others suggested avoiding baths, believing open pores made you vulnerable to disease. The truly desperate tried everything from bloodletting to wearing charms made of dried toads. One treatment for plague involved placing a split pigeon on the infected person's buboes, open sores caused by the disease. It was supposed to draw out the poison. Spoiler, it didn't, and yet such practices continued for centuries. In another case, emeralds were crushed and consumed as a remedy for infection. Unsurprisingly, this did more harm than good. Worse still, mercury was often used to treat conditions like syphilis. Patients were made to inhale mercury vapors or rub it on their skin. Not only did this fail to cure the disease, but it also led to mercury poisoning, a brutal way to die. Mental illness was also deeply misunderstood. Conditions like epilepsy were often interpreted as demonic possession, leading to exorcisms instead of treatment. Women's health, too, was frequently neglected or misunderstood. The term hysteria originated from the belief that the uterus wandered the body and caused irrational behavior. Despite centuries of accumulated knowledge, these errors show how guesswork often masquerades as science. Medicine wasn't yet rooted in evidence. It was bound to tradition, religion, and fear. And while some treatments were harmless or even helpful, many others were outright dangerous. Still, even from these dark missteps, something lasting emerged. The errors forced questions. The questions sparked curiosity. And eventually, that curiosity led to progress. Despite the many failures and frightening treatments of medieval medicine, its legacy runs deeper than we often acknowledge. The Middle Ages didn't just preserve fragments of ancient knowledge, they laid the groundwork for future breakthroughs that would shape the medical world we know today. Take the idea of institutionalized care. Hospitals in the medieval era evolved from monastic hospitality centers into places where healing and observation were prioritized. This concept of a dedicated space for the sick, offering food, rest, and basic care, was revolutionary at the time. It planted the seed for modern healthcare infrastructure. The practice of record-keeping, though rudimentary, began to shift medicine from anecdotal tradition to evidence-informed practice. Early hospital logs and patient notes helped practitioners track symptoms, observe disease patterns, and refine treatments. In essence, this was the precursor to clinical documentation. Medieval scholars also started to question old texts and apply their own observations, a key turning point. By the late Middle Ages, universities were teaching medicine based on a blend of classical knowledge and new inquiry. This transition from blind acceptance to critical thinking set the stage for the scientific revolution. Even flawed practices like bloodletting carried a deeper lesson, that the body's internal balance mattered. This early exploration into systemic health, misguided as it was, eventually evolved into more accurate models of anatomy, circulation, and pathology. Perhaps most importantly, the Middle Ages kept medical inquiry alive. While mistakes were made, so were critical steps forward. Without this era, its monasteries, its translations, its experiments, modern medicine might have never found its footing. The legacy of medieval medicine isn't one of pure horror, it's one of survival, adaptation, and progress in the face of uncertainty. And it reminds us that even the darkest chapters in history can contain the roots of transformation. Medieval medicine wasn't just superstition and suffering. It was the messy, often misunderstood beginning of something bigger. From bloodletting to hospitals, from herbal cures to organized care, it all shaped the path to modern medicine. The next time you hear someone scoff at medieval healthcare, just remember, without the past, there'd be no future to heal.